You would think it'd be easy to appoint an interior minister. After a 2-week vacancy and several snubs, Emmanuel Macron, in the end, settling on loyal insider Christophe Castaner, the French president, without a top cop since the stormy resignation of veteran politician Jacques Coon, an early defector to the cause of Macron the candidate. Today, Coon prefers to go back to his old job as mayor of France's second city, Lyon. Is Macron a difficult man to work with? Is character the issue for a 40-year-old president who'd never been elected to office until his independent bid last year? Or is the problem just simply France's constitution, where wielding all the powers inevitably goes to the head of the commander-in-chief? Can Macron shed the arrogant label that's been pinned on him and return to the image of the inclusive moderate that convinced voters on the campaign trail last year? The stakes are high. Just how high? In times of Brexit, a continent caught between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, a continent where that other motor of Europe, Germany, is experiencing the same decline in the old post-war political order that France is going through. Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Macron malaise. And with us, Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the news website The Modern World. How are you?
Good, thank you.
We're also joined by Famke Krummuller of policy consultants Open Cities with a Z. How are you? From Brussels, Martin Michelot, Deputy Director of Europeum, the Institute for European Policy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Now, some thought he would hit the reset button with a major overhaul of his cabinet. Instead, only 3 changes, 2 minor additions, and Castaner, who was already in the cabinet in a more junior role. Castaner, who is also the party leader for Emmanuel Macron, his on-the-move party. He was welcomed to the job by Prime Minister Édouard Philippe, the Prime Minister who then defended his choice before Parliament, answering one conservative lawmaker who called this a cheap version of House of Cards.
The French voted, and they gave this government a majority. And our goal with the members of government focused on their job is to ensure that we can deliver on the commitments made by the president. In other words, this isn't a surprise. On the contrary, we are going forward and persevering.
That 2-week vacancy at the Interior Ministry, what does it tell you, Alexis Poulain?
It tells trouble. It tells that unpreparation. The fact that the former Interior Ministry, Jacques Coon, left in a rush, really, because he didn't took the time to say, oh, I'm running for being a mayor of Lyon, the city where he came from.
What's that all about? What is that all about?
It's that's the question. I think there's a lot in there. Since the summer, we had this affair of the bodyguard called Alexandre Benalla, and
he was caught on video roughing people up while impersonating a police officer during on the sidelines of May Day demonstrations.
And then there's been a cover-up to at the Élysée, and they've asked people to testimony and say, oh, I didn't know this guy, or there's nothing. And I think Jacques Coon was fed up with this, the fact that he was put aside in decision. He thought that he could also discuss with the president and be more of a counsel or a father figure to some extent. And I think there's been a lot of disappointment for him. And leaving the way he did, when you know that interior ministry is key in the Fifth Republic, in France, and for security of the state and of the French citizen, is very worrying for all of us, even if Édouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, standing new and did the job. But here you go. And the nomination of Castaner is another very mixed message that you can get.
I think that's an important point. Martin Michelot, in France, the Interior Ministry, there's something Napoleonic about it, because you have all these prefects, these state superintendents that are named all around France. It's almost like there's a parallel state run by the Interior Minister.
Well, under certain presidents, there has certainly been a tendency for the Ministry of Interior to have an outsized role in French governance. And as a matter of fact, it seemed that Jacques Coon did, in fact, want to play the role that he had in Lyon as a see-in-all mayor, and he wanted to play that role at the Ministry of Interior. But there must have been a certain resistance within the En Marche party, within also the persona of Emmanuel Macron, who does not want to let certain people come too close to him and have too much of an influence on him that may have disappointed then Minister Collomb and actually have led him to go back to Lyon in a premature fashion. Then, of course, you also had the local factors is that the right wing, the conservatives, were starting to make a play in Lyon, and Collomb wanted to hold on to that seat, and unconsciously, in a way, provoked this sort of mini governmental crisis.
And what's your reading of this 2-week vacancy?
Look, I mean, I think the first thing that it says is that the En Marche, it highlights what En Marche is. And En Marche is a movement. It's not a political party. It's a fairly heterogeneous movement of people coming from the left, from the right, from the center, and it's a movement that lacks history. I mean, this is just by the virtue of its very recent creation, and therefore it has not been able to attract political heavyweights that could fill in such an important role as Minister of Interior, but also that could fill in, more smaller ministries such as the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry of Territorial Cohesion. So En Marche is still a movement that is growing. We could say right now that it is in its teething period because, it is starting to figure out how things work, how things taste. And as a matter of fact, the making of a government is something that can sometimes taste unpleasant.
En Marche, it's called a movement, but it is a political party, Famke Krummüller. After all, it's got, I don't know how many, it's got an oversized majority in Parliament. It's been a year and a half. Is it still an acceptable reason that it's teething still, or is it time
to a certain extent, it certainly is.
Should it have matured by now?
It's a very young movement, as you said as well. Macron has never been elected before. Everybody is kind of new in their roles, and Macron is really trying to hold a very difficult equilibrium, which is really position himself center left, center right, attract the same amount of political personalities from both the left and the right, from civil society, and men and women. And he's really, he wants to show continuity in terms of what he had announced in the very beginning when he formed his first government. And it turns out that is a really big challenge. And I also think that's why it took 2 weeks to form this new government. On top of that, it seemed like there was disagreement with his prime minister about the extent of the reshuffle, how many people would really have to go. Prime Minister has been saying already when Nicolas Hulot left a few weeks ago that there should be a bigger reshuffle.
The popular environment minister.
Exactly. Macron at the time refused, and this time seemed to have accepted that a few more people would have to go.
Macron comes in promising he'll be a strong president, even used the word Jupiterian president. You heard Martin Michelot talk about, well, him and Gérard Collomb, there was friction over who makes the decisions. Macron, whose party originally En Marche, on the move, En Marche, the initials EM are the same as his own initials. Is he too big-headed?
It's very complicated. It's certainly, at the end of the day, the message that he's sending to his electorate, and that might just not always be well received. Certainly when now, for example, we're entirely focused on one scandal or one diversion after the other, when he's actually promoting big and important reforms that we should probably be focusing on much more, and it would be much more interesting to a certain extent. But unfortunately, the way that he's trying to present himself attracts all the attention, which is contrary to what he ultimately claimed he wants to be doing.
France, one of the only democracies in Western Europe where you don't have that separation between the president and the prime minister, in a sense. The president is the one who has all the power, and so the symbols do matter. Last month, during UN Week in New York, Macron remained one of the star attractions, very popular there, but his boy wonder demeanor can rub voters the wrong way. Some thought he went too far when he appeared to stroke the Pope's cheek during a June visit to the Vatican. It got even more controversial recently when Macron exchanged with a young, out-of-work horticulturist who complained that he'd sent his job applications around and hadn't heard back.
There are jobs that require a certain skill set. People are trained for these roles. That's why we invest. But there's other jobs to be snapped up. Honestly, any cafe or restaurant. I cross the street, I'll find you one. They simply want people who are willing and ready to work.
Alexis Poulain, this cross the street and you can cross the street and get a job comment. Your thoughts on that and what it says about Emmanuel Macron?
It says that when Jupiter comes with the mortals, it doesn't fit very well. It was all about some people. I mean, the people still with Emmanuel Macron thinks that it's words of wisdom and saying that it's true that you need to look out for jobs. But the job market is tricky in France. I mean, it's very difficult, and jobs are somehow there. But he was saying to someone who wants to work in a certain field to work in restaurants, which is not exactly a conception of inclusion or formation or getting the job you want. And if you look at the figure of Emmanuel Macron, you see that he was flying high and now he's diving really fast. And he had trouble attracting new talents, new people to the movement, République En Marche. And it shows with this government reshuffle, you can see that there is no star or no big heavyweight from the French politics coming to the rescue. And putting Castaner, who was one of the first circle, was there from the start. He was cheering up crowds during the campaign. He's coming from the left. But, really, what does it say? It says that, is he alone, really, at the Élysée Palace? Or does he have some support still to grow the movement and make a proper government and manage the policy he promised during the elections?
Or he wants to be sure that he's got nobody in place who can actually defy his authority to a certain extent.
That's pretty much it.
And Castaner is somebody who's really close, as you said, one of the first to have joined his movement. And obviously for Macron and his position, that's kind of a comfortable position to a certain extent to be in, right? Because he's a very close follower of his movement.
But Emmanuel Macron, who promised it wouldn't be politics as usual, not from one of the two traditional mainstream parties, who seemed very at ease on the campaign trail, talking with ordinary citizens. And yet now he's got this reputation of being the president of the rich, who's aloof. What do you make of his personality?
Well, I would first like to say I also think there's something like path dependency with the institutions. As a president of a country, you're always dependent on the institutions, on the political culture around you. You can claim that you want to change it, and those are maybe good intentions, but at the end of the day, you're always dependent on the institutions, the ministries, the way of doing of things around you. You can't change it that fast. That's delusional.
Martin Michelot, is it just simply that, well, when you're president of France and you've got a big majority in parliament and you've got a judiciary that's not as strong as in, say, Germany or the United States, that and you've got advisors around you every day telling you how great you are, that it goes to your head?
Well, look, I think that to answer your question, Macron is trying to find a third way in terms of exercising the presidency. You had Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president, prime minister, MP, lawmaker, and judge and journalist all at the same time. Then he was followed by François Hollande, who himself wanted to be, a very peaceful president, la présidence normale, the normal presidency, taking the train to Brussels, behaving like everyone else. Except this was not possible. And Macron himself, actually, what he is trying to do is that he is trying to model what the presidency should look like in terms of how it was designed by the Fifth Republic, where Macron, given the fact that he cannot be destituted by the National Assembly or by a referendum, is actually exercising the full reign of his power, and is putting all the pressure on the prime minister to put in all the pressure on Edouard Philippe, on the prime minister, to make all the difficult decisions
with one noticeable difference.
The policies. So
with one noticeable difference, which is, it was General de Gaulle who founded the Fifth Republic, and he stayed, as he put it, above the fray, and he let his prime minister do the actual policy making, whereas Macron seems to get his hands dirty and is the one who makes all the decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely, but I think that in a modern presidency, there needs to be a sort of impulse that is given by the president. And the impulse can be given in one of two ways. It can be given in the traditional, dictating the policy sort of way, the policy which is derived from the presidential program. But the policy can also come from, actually an interaction with the one that was shown previously, or as a matter of fact, the message that Macron is sending, and we can agree with it or not, is that, well, perhaps you did your field of study in one thing, but you need to adapt. And this is very much symbolic of what Macron wants, which is more, Scandinavian-style flexi-security in the labor market. And this is something that he is trying to push forward. And this also allows him to send one key message, which is that he is actually able to talk to the people, and she is actually able to use their language. At times, this may seem a bit uneasy, as we've also seen with a previous interaction with a younger kid who called him Manu, and he scolded him, almost slapped his hand with a ruler and told him, "You need to call me Mr. President." But you can see that President Macron is actually trying to use his popular image also to dictate policy, and this is something that Edouard Philippe is actually only able to react to in the current institutional setup.
All right, I'll get the reaction of our panel to what you've just said, Martin. When we come back, stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And on the day of what has turned out to be a minor cabinet reshuffle in France, we're discussing it all with Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the news website The Modern World, Famke Krummeler of policy consultants Open Cities, and from Brussels, Martin Michelot, deputy director of European, the Institute for European Policy. We're talking about an Emmanuel Macron. Again, this dichotomy between a Macron who's popular abroad, but if you look at the latest survey that was out last month, his popularity at home had dipped to 33% lower than his predecessor, François Hollande, at the same time in his presidency. Those are the various surveys you can see. Now you see his popularity does go up slightly when the first reforms took place at the end of last year, when they were passed. And then there's a first dip that takes place at the start of the year. And then the big slide begins with that scandal that Alexis Poulain was mentioning with his former bodyguard. Alexis, is it about Macron, or would this have been the fate of any French president? Because in this country, you have institutions where if you're not in a power-sharing deal, which was the case for Chirac and Mitterrand, you're not going to get reelected. No French president has ever gotten reelected while having a standing majority in the French parliament.
The cohabitation.
It's because
I think it's a bit of both. I think what happened was...
Is it too much power? Should the Constitution have put too much power in the president's hand?
Well, first thing, I think about Macron popularity, I think there was a brand Macron. He was young, dynamic. He was supposed to be the new world and change things. And this brand has been severely damaged by the Benalla case and the way he reacted to this. It was a terrible communication all the way through until now. And it's like industrial mistake, It's like you're a big brand and you have a big issue with a factory. You have to react with crisis communication. It didn't, or not the right crisis communication. And then you have the other issue about the institution, that France used to be a French regime with the president was elected for 7 years, and then you had election for the Senate, for the Assembly, and then we cut it to 5 years. And there went this thing where French wanted to be American, so we tried to be sort of American with the French Constitution. It doesn't work, and that's why we have this, and it's faster day after day and president after president, the way they are pushed back.
So, Famke, we had the first 12 years after the war where there were 25 governments under an old constitution. And since we've had these sort of super presidents. Your thoughts on that?
I think what's happening right now, and it reminds me to a certain extent what's also going on in Germany, is that the political landscape and the priorities of the electorate, etc., are changing, but they still need to fit an old political system that is just not adapted anymore. And you get this weird combination of
So what would you change?
You need constitutional change in France right now to adapt to this thing. I mean, the first element is that France used to be a bipartisan system, and it's clearly not anymore. And it creates all sorts of weird tensions that the system is not really used to, nor are its actors. So maybe it's time to update these types of things.
Martin Michelot, is it just simply that the veneer has come off and that, well, all these countries in Western Europe, they're social democracies. So center-left and center-right are basically nuances, and now the voters know it.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about nuances, and to go back to Macron's popularity, the other thing that may, also structurally explain why he may be unpopular today is the fact that, to an extent, the opposition, it's very hard if you consider yourself a social democrat to identify yourself with the opposition, which is either the extreme left, La France Insoumise, or the extreme right, Rassemblement National. So in a way, if you place all your hopes in the catch-all party of Emmanuel Macron, then yes, the veneer may be cracking, and this is perhaps one of the limits of the political gamble that Macron has been taking, which is really to redefine the politics not on the left versus right spectrum, but on the globalist versus territorialist or globalist versus nationalist spectrum, which may be coming back to haunt him. I don't think this is necessarily a function or a limitation of the Fifth Republic as it exists. It is mostly a function of the way the world functions today and of the role of France in the European Union.
Yeah, just how hard it is to hit the reset button. It's a question that Alison Sargent has been asking.
Emmanuel Macron is looking for a second wind. But new ministers don't mean new policies. The Élysée says the government plans to keep their calendar for economic reforms, overhauling unemployment benefits and streamlining the pension system by next summer.
It's going to be the same business-friendly, tax-cutting approach as we've previously seen under Macron for the past 18 months. This is part of the problem, because it's also a government, the outgoing and no doubt the incoming, that is increasingly challenged on that policy agenda.
To face the challenges, Macron's team will need to remain steady and looks built to do so, with his finance and public accounts ministers unchanged and a loyal ally at the Interior Ministry. The government's second objective, preparing for European elections this May, the first electoral test for Emmanuel Macron's party since he took office. For that, the government will be looking to revive the president's approval rating, currently hovering around 30%.
Macron's problem is that he was very early labelled a president of the rich, and many of his reforms have borne that out. The tax breaks and other policies that he has already implemented, as well as some that are in the pipeline. So he has the problem of shifting a label that has already been solidifying around him. It's very, very difficult.
To fight the idea that he's out of touch, the president will be multiplying his efforts to connect with French people outside of the capital. Already on his agenda, a tour of northeastern France in early November to mark the World War I centenary.
Vanke Krummeler, can he hit the reset button? Can he shed the label of president of the rich?
I think the main problem that he's been having actually over the past few months is, as I mentioned before, that people have people and the press and everybody have been much focused on scandals, on political issues that are relatively minor, and nobody's talking about the reforms anymore. I mean, look at the banana scandal over the summer. We've been literally talking about it for 2 months non-stop, and as a result, the entire parliamentary calendar got delayed because of parliamentary inquisition committees, etc. Constitutional reform has been delayed. Pension reform has been delayed as a result of this, and we're not really talking about his reforms.
That pension reform is going to hit civil servants hard. There's cuts in research for the public research budget. These are not popular measures.
Certainly not. But I still don't think that his current drop of popularity is linked to these reforms, because we haven't been discussing them.
No,
I don't think people are focusing on these reforms at all.
Well,
but that also means if these are the next issues that we're discussing, it will be difficult.
No, I think there's two things. One is, of course, the brand has been damaged for good, and he hasn't delivered on the promises, which happened to all French presidents. But after a year, it's very short time, and it's very going from high to very low. And the other thing is that one of the base of the people who voted for Emmanuel Macron were the pensioners. And I think the pension reform was the one that was discussed, and the fact that he made some cuts with more asking for efforts from the pensioners has been a difficult move, and he lost a lot of support from that. And the third thing that is more worrying is that En Marche, the movement, has been disappointing for the people who joined the movement. They saw that it would be new, it would be horizontal, there would be a lot of democracy, and in the end it was an empty shell. And you had Castaner, who was the boss, and just saying, oh, we'll do some big march and we'll try to do Europe and this, but there was no democracy in this movement. And apart from being the shell that pushed Emmanuel Macron to the Élysée, there is not much in there about shaping a program, working on the ground, and proposing that some people will actually move up and become newly elected, or something will happen. And you can see it. Not only the base has left, but trying to get people coming from the top to the government is proving very difficult now. So that's worrying, I think.
Martin Michelot, how does this bode for, I know they're not the most important elections, but still, those European elections, which are the first electoral test for Macron since he was elected in 2017, those are coming up in the spring.
Well, if there is one policy on which Macron is still positively viewed by the French population, it is the European election. Now, that it is the European issues. Now, that is based on the premise that the election will actually be about European issues and not a referendum on his, a midterm referendum on his presidency. And that, unfortunately, I believe, will be the case. Of course, it has an extremely symbolic value, which will say something about his ability to exercise power in the near future if he does not hold on. Because, the stakes are so high in terms of the European image, in terms of the European ambition that he has set out for himself, that any disappointment on this front would be extra harmful to him compared to, it has not been as harmful for François Hollande during his presidency, when his party also lost the European elections quite heavily. And if anything, it could actually provide quite a strong boost both to the Front National and to La France Insoumise if they actually make a very good showing, because then if you look at the European landscape of the nationalist, nativist parties such as Rassemblement National, then there will be a bigger and bigger counterweight at the European Parliament level for the future, against the future of European integration. So there is a national dimension to it, which I would not overplay that much. But I think the European dimension could actually be one of the most harmful things for him to mitigate if there were to be a negative result.
The political fault lines changing in France. You mentioned how the party of Emmanuel Macron sucking a lot of the air, maybe taking too much terrain by taking many from the center left, many from the center right. Political fault lines changing across the Rhine as well. This weekend saw the far right enter Bavaria's parliament for the first time, the AfD establishing itself across Germany at the expense of mainstream conservatives. While in the same election on Sunday, the Greens leapfrogged the Social Democrats as the main opposition force in Bavaria. This crowded field, you mentioned it a little bit, Famke, this crowded field that we're seeing in Germany's politics, it seems to be the opposite of what we're getting in France, where yes, it's more polarized, but there's fewer big players.
Well, I would actually argue the opposite. I think what's happening in both countries is that mainstream center-left and center-right parties are losing, and there are more and more parties that are gaining more votes, and it fragments the parliamentary landscape, and it leads to instability at the end of the day. In Germany, the Greens, as you just said, are becoming increasingly popular. The AfD, the far right, is entering several parliaments, and this is new, and it increases the numbers of parties, and it makes coalition formation much more difficult.
Why is mainstream unpopular? Is it boring?
I think the mainstream parties have failed to renew themselves, and the result of that has been that I think especially the younger electorate or the electorate that's aware of new challenges that are coming up just don't feel represented anymore by the mainstream parties who've been maybe too comfortable in their position, holding, being in power for years and holding the majority for years.
Yeah, and they've been failing. And I think the global picture is that we're in a change of worlds. I mean, we're transiting to something else. And the big parties, they were all about employment, about growth, economic growth, about competition, about being in the world stage and selling more stuff everywhere, energy. And you can see the Greens, they are connected to what is happening now. What is at stake is what is the future, what's next? Can we go on like that forever? And the answer is no. And younger generation, us, and we start to know it. And it's not just about making money. It's about making a living, a decent living for us and the future generation. And you can see climate change. The big event, like in France, we have more than 10 deaths. What's happening right now is visible. It's critical, and former parties are not connected to this change of mindset. And I think the Greens have a boulevard for the next elections.
Martin Michelot, you're in Brussels. What are the thoughts on the seminal changes we're seeing both in France and in Germany?
Well, the big question is how this will affect the balance of the European Parliament and eventually the balance of the European Union after the elections. The question is whether Macron will be able to unite behind him a certain amount of parties that will provide a counterweight to the traditional Christian right party, which has been dominated the European Parliament. The question is whether the Party of European Socialists can actually hold on to be the second force when you see the decline of SPD in Germany or the decline of the Socialist Party in France. And basically, at the end, it seems that this upcoming European election will turn out to be a debate between Emmanuel Macron on one side and on the other hand, the unholy alliance of Salvini and Orban, the Italian and the Hungarian prime minister. And the question is whether if this cleavage translates at the European level, then we may have a Europe that will become much more political, but in which it will also be harder to find compromises. And to go back to what the original discussion was all about, well, as a matter of fact, when you have a president who can actually make the hard decisions, it is perhaps much more easier than when you have a system such as the European Union, when you need to find compromises, which will possibly become much harder to find.
Yeah, but that message of Emmanuel Macron's the pull yourself up by your bootstrap. We played that clip earlier, him telling that horticulturalist to go across the street and he'll find work. How does that play in France? Do the French want to hear that?
I don't think that the French people who would be, let's say, interested in voting for the Green Party want to hear that. That being said, the function this serves, that it serves this function of parler vrai, of speaking the truth, which is something that Macron has been trying to take. I mean, Macron is someone who clearly said during the campaign, I want to make mine the use of the word of populism, because it is policies that are designed for the people. So as a matter of fact, this is Macron's gentle form of populism, without going to the extent that we would compare him with, true nativist nationalist parties, such as the case of the ones who are ruling Italian politics right now. So perhaps French people don't want to hear it, but this is also part of a communication strategy of President Macron, and this is also one of the ways that politics is done today.
Famke Krummüller?
I think it also, though, nourishes something that has been a big problem in France, where we have a lot of the electorate thinking or feeling like they're not understood by the elite politicians governing from Paris. And so typically this type of comment reinforces this idea of not being understood and just not facing the same type of problems, let's say, than the politicians in Paris are facing. And that's obviously nourishing the extreme vote, both to the left and to the right.
So, Alexis Poulain, French politics has had a tsunami with the election of Macron. It's blown up the center-left and center-right. What's the next tsunami?
I don't know if it's the next tsunami or if it's rebuilding on both sides, on the left and on the right. And looking at what's happening in the center is being very unpromising so far. If there is a tsunami, then of course it would be a big win from Marine Le Pen, anti-EU party Rassemblement National at the European election, which would trigger then a big question about legitimacy of Emmanuel Macron to follow up on the reform, on the plan he had for Europe. That would be the tsunami, but nothing is like such on the map. We'll have to wait and see for the campaign. I think it's a very interesting time all over the place in Europe to just put more clarity in the game. This liberalism, being centrist and trying to do a policy for the past, which is still about employment, more oil, more money, more growth, that's over. I think it's time to think about how we make things differently with the neighbors and with ourselves, because every country in Europe has a trouble between cities and countryside, and people don't talk to each other. It's not so much about the neighbors, it's about how do you build a nation these days if you don't have anything to relate from the man of the countryside and the man of the city? That's very dangerous for all of us in Europe. It's not so much immigration, the problem here. It's really what is growth about, what is globalization about, who are the winners, who are the losers, and everyone has to be winning in the end, and so far it's not the case. So I think that's the big tsunamis. Reunite nations and make them talk and make Europe a great idea for the future.
All right, on that lofty note, we'll leave it there. Alexis Poulain, I want to thank you, Famke Krummüller, and Martin Michelot for being with us from Brussels. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So lots of coverage of the reshuffle that eventually came. And just to show some of the headlines, mostly in France, but I look at some of the other headlines as well. This is in the Express in the UK from yesterday. Macron government reshuffle postponed again, sparking outrage from Jean-Luc Mélenchon. If he was outraged yesterday, I think he's a lot more outraged today.
The Daily Express relays the leader of the far left in France.
Yeah, he's being almost touted as the head of the opposition at this stage. In any case, this is an image that's coming back a lot lately, somewhat ironically. Le maître des horloges, as he was known since the beginning of his presidency. In other words, he who had sort of almost absolute
control
power
of time.
Exactly, pulling the strings and deciding on when the reforms are going to be rolled out. And of course, that's all been turned on its head since this summer, since the Ben Allah scandal, when his chief of security was found to have been involved in scuffles and all sorts of inappropriate behaviour. And really, it was the beginning of Macron losing his allure of I suppose, power, really. So Macron, what he had been saying to France 24, as Mark Perlman, amongst others, over the last number of days when he was interviewed at any point about this, is, look, he was going to take his time. He wanted to make sure it was the right people in the key posts and that he was too busy to rush it. So I guess that's trying to echo the idea that he's still master of the timing and all of that. But really, it seems a lot of journalists now don't believe in that anymore. The master of timing has become a sand merchant. No, maybe it's
with
difficult.
an hourglass.
There you go. That's exactly it. So it's sort of, again, the image of being in control of the timing being turned on its head, almost literally. What else do we have? Jean-Luc Mélenchon. This is yesterday, and I think it's the tweet that maybe L'Express picked up on. Another delay. This is a collapse in the authority of the president.
Collapse in the authority of
And
the
if he said it like that in a tweet, he's been saying in his weekly online sort of video casts, stuff that's even more, I suppose, provocative. He's basically saying that it's now the Prime Minister who is the real power in the government, and Emmanuel Macron. And the reason for the delay, according to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is that they didn't agree on the key positions. And we've never seen this before in the Fifth Republic, where the President and the Prime Minister are at odds over a cabinet reshuffle. So I think that neatly brings us to the front page of Le Monde today. The new balance of the government, and I think the fact that they picked a photo of these two men is no accident, because indeed the whole
there was arbitration, it seems.
Indeed. Now, some are saying, and I think it's a fair point, this is Caroline de Grité on Twitter saying, I don't understand why everyone is so upset about a president and prime minister having fierce debates before appointing ministers. And didn't we agree that new ministers have to be checked extensively before being appointed to prevent scandals? So I guess that's a position that is sympathetic of Emmanuel Macron's decision to take his time in picking these key positions.
Now, in France, regularly, political parties have a problem because campaign finance rules are very stringent, and a lot of them get caught in their hand in the cookie jar, fudging those their accounts to be able to make ends meet. Right. It seems as though you were mentioning Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
Right.
The leader of the far left is in the crosshairs of the judiciary right now.
That's right. So this morning, if anyone was following the Facebook page of Jean-Luc Mélenchon or on Twitter or whatever, they would have been getting these Facebook Live videos coming up on their feed, where he live filmed basically and posted it on Facebook Lives, the police raid on his home and on his party headquarters, because indeed France's anti-corruption office is investigating the France Unbowed party for various issues to do with maybe European parliamentary money being used to pay staff in French national offices, and also perhaps irregularities around the French presidential campaign. He was a candidate. So he put up on Facebook a video basically live tracking it, saying that I'm an MP. It's a sacred role. You don't touch me. Keep your hands off me.
A sacred role.
A sacred role. He got mocked for that because it sort of feeds into the image that he's a little bit. He has a big ego. And elsewhere, he then addressed a message directly to Emmanuel Macron saying, when you search through my computer, you know very well that you were doing something dishonest, rotten and twisted. So he was basically calling it a political act, that the timing of it on the day of the reshuffle was political. The various people responded to that, in particular the Justice Ministry saying this was nothing to do with us. It was the prosecutor's office. We had no role in this. In other words, this is speculation that it's political, and it's untrue. So he also got some support from, for example, the leader of Podemos, Pablo Iglesias, who said the timing of this is a little bit suspect, and giving his support to Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So certainly a hectic day in French politics.
Yeah, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who compared himself to Lula in Brazil.
That's right. That's right.
James Creedon, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.